Hello, bird nerds. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd. This is the Bird Emergency, the show where I get to speak with amazing scientists about bird conservation, bird research, bird conservation policy, all that kind of stuff. And today we're bird adjacent because we're going to be speaking with an ecologist who works for an amazing Australian partnership of universities and institutes, CSIRO, monitoring the entire ecosystem of Australia, terrestrial ecosystem data collection on a national scale. And if you had no idea that was a thing, welcome to Samantha Monroe, Dr. Samantha Monroe, ecologist with TERN, sitting in Adelaide, out at the University of Adelaide. Sam, thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to meet you. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, look, it's great to be able to speak to you. I reached out to you because I wanted to be able to sort of talk a bit more about data, and I wanted people to understand how the information that gets into all of the recovery plans and the submissions that go to government to make decisions and the, the information that people rely on when they're putting in applications for grants. It's all got to come from somewhere. And the group, that's not a big enough word. The organisation, the collective that you work for, is uh, an astounding body in the Australian scene. So, ecologist Samantha Monroe, tell us about your pathway to landing at your role at TERN.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's a little bit nebulous. It's very a windy road that I wound up taking to the job that I have now for sure. Because I work for a terrestrial ecosystem monitoring organization now, but I didn't get my start on land. I actually got my there I am. I got my PhD studying sharks in Queensland, working at James Cook University in Townsville. Oh gosh, I look really young in that. That's a really long time ago. That photo was almost 10 years ago now, was when I got my PhD studying sharks.
Uh, what led you? I mean, look, you've you've got an accent. I know that you
Yes.
came from Canada. So did you arrive to do a a PhD, or did you do some of your undergraduate stuff in Australia?
No, I did my undergraduate degree in Canada in biology. And as part of that, I was studying fish species there, which was a lot of fun. But when I finished my undergraduate degree, I was 23. I had gone to school very close to where I grew up, and I really, really wanted an adventure. When you're a student, you don't have a lot of funds to go on big, grand adventures. So the best way to do that, I thought, to combine my desire to travel and see the world, but also continue my education, combine those two things, come to Australia and do a PhD, and just to make the adventure even bigger, why not study sharks?
Fair enough, and what an amazing place to do it at James Cook. I did my placement when I finished my horticulture studies in Townsville. Uh, it's a fabulous part of the world. The the
Absolutely.
uh, Let's fingers crossed that we don't ruin the reef before before the end of the century. Uh, but yeah, what did you think coming from Canada? You didn't come from somewhere like Halifax, did you? And then end up at in the tropics of Australia.
That's actually exactly where I grew up. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. That's so funny. So I grew up in a really different climate to the one I wound up moving into. For those who are not familiar with Halifax, it's on the east coast and it's very foggy. It's It's very snowy a lot of the time. It's very rainy, and obviously it's not exactly warm. We have nice summers, but most of the time it is wet, cold, and windy. And moving to Townsville, Australia, complete culture shock, complete climate shock. I did not have any of the right clothes. I had to go out and buy tons of new clothes for the weather. And yeah, I brought all of these pairs of jeans with me that I didn't wind up ever wearing because it was so hot all of the time for a Canadian.
Unbelievably hot. When I was there, we had to start work at, I think, I can't remember if it was 6 a.m. or 6:30 a.m. and be knocked off, around 2 because it was just too hot to continue working any later.
Yeah, and it made it really tricky when we did our PhDs there, working out on a boat in the hot sun, trying to catch sharks. And we would start our days very early, sometimes before the sun came up, and you were coming back in right as it was going down. So it was full days in the full sun up there.
Now, just to wander off topic a little bit, moving from Townsville down to Adelaide, was that the first move that you, like, was that how you did it? You went from Townsville to Adelaide? You didn't go anywhere in between?
No, I did. I finished my PhD in Townsville, and then the first job I got was working at Griffith University, which is in Brisbane. And I went from studying sharks to studying crustaceans for a couple of years, working there. And then I moved to Adelaide after that, and got the job I have now, working at TERN.
So how did you find, this is something that I guess people from most other countries, unless they come from a country as large as Canada or as large as the US, or some of the big European, Asian countries, how about daylight savings and night and dusk? Like the difference between when it's late afternoon, evening, and when it's nighttime in Adelaide. You can have 3 hours in summer between it starting to get dark and being dark, whereas in Townsville it's like 10 minutes,
Instant.
if that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I got really used to not having to think about it actually in Townsville. And when I was growing up in Canada, especially in the winter, the sun would start going down at like 4 or 5 p.m. You got used to not having very much sunlight most of the year. And so now that I'm in Adelaide and there's like long summer nights, that's more what I'm used to from where I'm from.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're trying to place where Halifax is, and what is it? It's St. John. Is it St. John's?
Yeah, it's in Nova Scotia, the province.
Yeah, Nova Scotia. But I think that is the island that is just, if you're looking at the map of Canada and you see a little island about 3/4 of the way up, just off the east coast.
Oh no, that's Newfoundland. That's a different spot.
Newfoundland's the really big island, but there's that little one which is where Halifax is just across the water, isn't it?
So I think you're actually thinking of Prince Edward Island. We have a lot of little provinces all squished together, but Nova Scotia is attached to Canada through a land bridge. If you know where New York City is, just go north from New York City and eventually you'll hit Halifax.
And the only reason I know about Halifax is that there was a band that was big here in the 90s, early 2000s, Australian band that was also popular in Canada called Weddings, Parties, Anything. And they had a song called Saturday Night in Halifax was like the chorus. So there we go. That's why I actually know about that part of the world. You like a song and you find out about where it's from. Okay, so now we know the circuitous route to get to TERN.
Yes.
Tell us about TERN.
I would love to. So TERN, which it's an acronym, stands for Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. And we are a government-funded organization, and our job, in a nutshell, is we are Australia's ecosystem monitoring organization. We collect environmental data all across the country at virtually every possible scale. So we collect information using satellites in space, all the way down to people collecting soil samples so we can tell what kind of bacteria live in the soil, for example. We collect everything in between. And then a big part of our mission, the main mission of TERN, is to then make all of that data freely available to scientists anywhere in the world so that they can use that big data to answer their research questions and hopefully solve the big environmental problems that we're facing today.
Now, I've got the screen up. If you're listening later on the podcast, I'm sorry, you'll have to go to the website, and that will be thebirdemergency.com/TERN, capital TERN, capital T, capital E, capital R, capital N. And you can see the diagram I'm about to describe. So it's got the picture of Australia, and that's broken out into a transect, a little plot of land with someone monitoring soil with some sensors and a hole, someone doing a grid count, a tower that might be doing soundscape collection, audio monitoring. There's a plane flying overhead that looks like it might be doing a LiDAR survey or an infrared.
That's exactly what it's doing. That's right.
Or something. And there's someone doing looks like just doing normal survey in infrared spatial data collection, and then a satellite. But if we go down, it shows all the monitoring sites across Australia.
Yes.
And some of the photographs of the different methods of the data collection that's going on, and we're going to break out and talk about some of them. We should note that TERN is massive in terms of how many people are working for TERN, where they're located around Australia, and the kind of specialties that the people working there have in their skill set. So we don't expect Samantha to be an expert in every little bit of it, but we're trying to get an overview of the scope of the collection activities that are going on, the kind of equipment and methods that are being used, and then, as Sam just said a moment ago, getting all that information collected, analysed, processed, and then whacked out into an open source repository. So magnificent. Sam, over 800 collection sites you mentioned earlier on. The map shows pretty clearly that it's distributed over most of Australia and some points in New Zealand as well. And I'm guessing that this kind of activity is happening in many places in the world, trying to get a holistic view of all of the ecosystems around the world.
That's certainly fair to say. There are lots of different ecosystem monitoring organizations in lots of different countries, but they all operate a little bit differently, and they all focus on sometimes different priorities for the types of data that they want to collect.
How does TERN prioritize which locations to collect and what they're actually sampling for? Like what I know, and I'm using sampling in a really broad term that just in terms of how we're collecting information. But how does the site get selected? How is it prioritized?
Yeah, great question. So we want to make sure that we are representing all of the different habitats that we have in Australia. So when we initially started in 2011, we wanted to make sure we were establishing sites in the different types of biomes that we have in the country. So we wanted to make sure we were putting a few sites in grassland habitats, in woodlands, in forests. That was really how we started. Now the way that we select sites it's far more statistical than it used to be. We actually now have programs that help us identify based on climate and the information we have about plants, for example, that live in different parts of the country. They allow us to identify very specifically the regions of the country that we still need to visit to get more information. We can actually create heat maps that show us ecologically the parts of the country we still need to get to make sure we've covered absolutely everything that we can. So that's how we choose our sites now. It's a very technical way of doing it. But when we started, we really just focused on making sure we were getting all of those major habitat types and building from there.
When did TERN start? When did it kick off?
Yeah, so TERN is, as we sort of know it today, it was roughly 2011. But bits and pieces of TERN probably existed before that. They just weren't operating as one unit. And so what happened was they all got amalgamated together. So where all those different types of data that we collect, they were being collected, but by separate organizations. And then they were brought together to be more well coordinated so that basically so that we're minimizing our costs, maximizing our gains, and everybody's working together really well for the same mission.
Yeah, it just seems obvious, doesn't it, that you want everyone to be sharing the information and coordinating, and that nobody's reinventing the wheel, and that people are not going out and duplicating surveys in areas where representative data has already been collected.
Yeah, and it isn't just about preventing duplication. It's also about making sure that the different scales of data that we collect can be integrated and work well together. So for example, we provide a lot of satellite data for looking, for example, at all of the tree cover across all of Australia. So we provide big maps that show roughly where all of the forests and tree cover is across the country. But we want to make sure that can be integrated with the teams we send out into the field that are literally going out to these small little surveys and counting the physical trees that are there from the ground. We want to make sure all the different scales of data complement one another so that if a scientist wants to use one type of data, they can confidently use all the other types of data together.
Just want to ask you whether what kind of projects that might have been in the news recently have been under the TERN umbrella. Like the one I'm particularly thinking of is was it Richard McClellan doing the Sandalwood Transect? Was that part of TERN?
I'm not sure. I'm so sorry. I'm not familiar with that one.
Well, you can't be familiar with all. I didn't even get his name right, I'm sure, and I was following it on Twitter. There are so many people out there doing so many things, and everybody's blasting out their work on all the socials and everything. So it's really hard to keep up with everything. Nobody can do that. How about we we zoom in on what your role is and what projects you have been working on that people may be aware of, and why are they important?
Well, one of the big projects that myself and a few of my TERN colleagues have been working on recently that I think is quite relevant to the bird emergency is we've recently made a map of Australia, a biochemical map for plants in Australia that we can actually use to track bird migration. And all we need from the bird is a drop of blood or a little bit of a feather.
So explain how you collect the drop of blood or the feather. Can people send them in, or do you have people out there looking for, like in particular locations where known migrations are happening? Tell us how you're doing that, and then we'll talk about the map.
Well, actually, we don't do the bird part. So this is where the aspect of the fact that TERN creates the big data for other people to then go out and take advantage of. One of the important things to know about TERN and TERN scientists like myself is we don't really do the research part. Our job is to create the big data to enable others. So we make the maps, and then we give people the opportunity to use it to track birds or any other migratory species.
So that particular instance of the bird migration, where is that raw data that is then, is it submitted to TERN and then you like synthesize it into a way that it can be meshed into all the other known data? How it,
So I guess it depends on the types of data. So for example, we have people who utilize data from satellites. Of course, we didn't build those satellites. We take the data, we synthesize it, and we create maps of Australia, for example, that show you where all of the trees are. But we also do go out and collect a lot of our own raw data. I'd say that's a lot of what we do is we go out and we collect all of this raw data from all around the country. So for example, I'm a part of a team that goes out and conducts massive surveys. They go out to all different parts of the country, some of the most remote, difficult to get to parts of the country. And we set up field survey sites where we measure all of the plant species that are found in there. We collect samples of all of the plant species we find in these survey sites. And we also collect soil samples from all of those field survey sites. So it's a bit of a mix, but we definitely collect most of our own raw data to make it available to people.
So which section of the site, if I'm looking for that project, the soil and the plant samples, where does that live on the site?
Our official name is, we're called ecosystem surveillance. And a big part of why we do this is to try and understand what change is happening in the environment and the direction of change. So, are we seeing more or less of certain plant species, for example? That would be a direction of change that we might be interested in.
And so I've got up on the screen now, that's the picture of all of the surveillance sites marked out. So again, covering everywhere. So if I want, am I able to find the data without being part of a university or some other organisation? Can I have a look at what plants are in that one of these sites in the Pilbara, for instance, or the Kimberley?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple different ways you can do that. We have something online called the TERN Data Discovery Portal, and it's basically Google for TERN. There it is. Yep, the Data Discovery Portal.
Yeah, we're going to do it real time, folks. So I'm in there. So which one am I looking at here?
So you can search by category. But you can also, if you knew a specific type of data that you were looking for, you could just search that as well.
Okay, so if I wanted to know where a particular eucalypt was found in one of your sites, what would I do? If I wanted to find eucalyptus...
you're about to get a lot of search results.
Rhodantha... look at that.
Yeah, so it'll give you a map, and what it'll probably do is it will show you every data set that we have where you got a positive hit for that search term. So some of it will be more relevant to what a scientist is looking for, and some of it may not be, and then they'll just go through all of the hits. Another way to do it that we offer people is also through software that scientists love to use. I'm not sure if anyone will have heard of it before, but it's called R. It's just the letter R, and it's it is a data analysis program, and you can access for free all of our plot data through that software as well. We've developed packages that people can do that. So in the same way you just searched for a species on our data discovery portal, you could also search through R, that same species, and you would find all of the plots where we've ever found that particular species, you would be able to search that. That's probably the easiest way for a scientist in particular to look up that information, because then they can right away just start analyzing it and running statistics on it.
And I like again, sorry for podcast listeners, but you can search by the field of research. So what I can see here: agricultural, vet, food sciences, biology, earth sciences, environmental sciences, physical sciences. You can search by region. But what's important for someone like me who needs to source images and find things, I can go by the Creative Commons licensed material.
Yes.
That I can then reproduce, that I don't have to then write a million emails saying, can I please represent that? So that is fabulous. I might just pull the screen down for a minute. So I see all those discussions on Twitter or people pleading, I can't make this thing in our work. Can someone tell me what this is? Now I understand what they're all going on about. I thought they were all just geeks trying to program something like in Python. But no, now I understand what it's all about.
Most of them are humble biologists, just like me, who love science but maybe don't love coding, and they are just trying to do some statistical analysis on their data, and they want to do it easily without having to become master programmers. And R is a great program for people like that, like me, who want to do science and they need some code to do it but maybe aren't master coders. So the whole point of us creating an R package was to make it really easy for people, even if you don't have a lot of programming experience, to access all our data.
I have to ask you about something you just said then, Sam. You said you're a biologist, but in the bio and whatnot that I was reading earlier on, you were saying you were an ecologist. So are you a biologist first and then an ecologist, or are you an ecologist first?
I guess it depends on what I'm doing that day. I think I wear a lot of different hats. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, and then I sort of transitioned into an ecologist, which is what I do now.
Yeah. So how do you self-identify? Like if you're out there, if you've gone to Pint of Science, you've gone out to a pub event where is the Criterion still going there in Townsville? I wonder. So you was it? It used to be called the Cry. It was that pub on the on the Strand.
I don't remember all the pubs on the Strand. I remember walking into them. I don't remember all of the names.
Point of asking that is, Pint of Science hold science events, taking science out to the community. So if you rocked in there and you met someone and they go, oh yes, well, are you an ecologist?
I'd say ecologist. That is probably how I would describe myself. But I wear lots of different hats in my job. Sometimes I'm a communicator. Sometimes I'm, like I said, programming code. So I'm a data scientist. It just depends on the day.
Well, let's take up on that point a little bit, Sam. How important is it nowadays? I guess this is a 2-bit question. How important is it for the actual institution, the organisation TERN, but how important do you feel it is yourself as a individual scientist, ecologist, to be getting the whole SciComm, the science communication part of the job right? And how do you feel that one, TERN is doing and you are doing?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I'll start with me. I've always been really, really passionate about science communication. It's been a big part of what I've done since I started my career. It's always been a part of what I've done. And I think that just comes from the fact that, when you work as a scientist, you live off of grant money, usually. And that grant money comes from taxpayers. It comes from the government. And I've always felt really strongly that scientists, to the best of their ability, because everyone's different and has different skills, but to the best of their ability, they should be out there telling the public about their work and how it impacts them. And not just because it's interesting, but because it can affect the decisions they make about their lives and how they vote. And if we, we can't complain about the society we have if we're not all trying to help create the best society possible. And I think scientists can do that by informing people. And I think the pandemic really brought that home, right? There was so much misinformation, but also so many scientists trying to help people understand the scientific process and walk them through that time of real uncertainty. And that showed how important it is to have scientists out there talking about things. So that's why I do it. And I think over the years I've gotten better, but there's always more you can learn. The last 2 years, I've been a part of a really amazing program in Australia called Superstars of STEM, which selects a cohort of women every 2 years. And I was lucky to be amongst them in 2021. And it's a 2-year training program. So it helps women who are working in all fields of science and technology basically become better at working with the media, telling their stories, whether that's social media or more traditional forms. So I like to think I've gotten a bit better over the last couple of years, but of course there's always more to learn.
I'll take that opportunity, Sam, too, to say to anybody, I don't care whether you are a recent graduate, doing a master's, PhD candidate, postgrad, or whether you're professor, diddly-do fiddlesticks, I don't care who you are. If you've got a story to tell that I can jam into the bird orbit, I'm happy to talk to you, because that's one of my big bugbears about how academic material gets published. It might be available for 30 days and then it disappears behind a paywall. And that, to me, is just wrong when most of that material, though, that work is undertaken with public money, be it in Australia or anywhere else in the world. It's nearly all coming from the public, and the public should be able to read and understand, because not everyone needs to have done a PhD to be able to make sense of an article. So I'm really encouraged by the emphasis that's been put lately on science communication. But then, Sam, I can't help myself to get a bit upset. It's the license you get with getting old, is you get to be a bit of a grumpy old man. And too much communication becomes PR, which often defeats the whole point of trying to be a good communicator. PR often doesn't deliver the truth. It delivers a message. But hey, look, let's not get too philosophical, because a lot of people would probably say, doing a show like mine, I talk about what I want to talk about. So am I delivering the truth? I don't know. But do you think how long have you been, has SciComm, science communication, been a big part of your role?
At TERN, or throughout my whole career? Because
throughout your career, now when I talk to people, it seems to be one of the top 3 or 4 things that they are really interested in about their work, their project, or whatever. They all want to communicate it. But I reckon, well, certainly going back to when was it, in the 90s, mid-90s, when I did horticulture, it was nowhere near as important. People they were wanting to publish in journals. Everyone wanted to write something into Australian horticulture. But the people like Melissa King, who got a job in commercial TV as it was, but she was doing radio and whatnot. But after she left Burnley, she worked a bit as a horticulturist, earning a paycheck, but she went straight out into communication. But I can only think of 2 or 3 others from my cohort at that time who went into comms. But now people are working in comms everywhere when they're graduating. So when did it become a major point for you to communicate the work you do in your paid employment with with TERN, to actually make it something to talk to me. And you mentioned before we started off that you've done lots of radio, so it's obviously important because you say yes. When people ask you, you say yes.
I do, although I have to be, I'm a scientist who communicates, right? So my full-time job is to do the science. And as you say, it's different for every job and every researcher, but publications in general are by far the most important thing you need to be doing. So sometimes you do have to be really careful that you don't let your desire to communicate overwhelm all the other things that you need to be prioritizing. It all has to be in balance. But it's been a big part of what I've done really since my PhD. When you study sharks, people are just absolutely fascinated by that topic. So pretty much anything you do, sometimes without you even really trying, winds up getting attention. I remember I wrote a report with a colleague about white shark movement in Victor Harbor here in South Australia. And we didn't do a press release. We didn't make a big deal out of it. It was just a report for the local council, and it got picked up, and we were getting interviewed about it. So one of the reasons it started, I think, was because of the topics that I chose to study, and it was a bit of a trial by fire. People were just interested whether I wanted to communicate about it or not. So I was thrust into it at the very beginning.
I might take this opportunity, Sam, for the people watching live. Feel free to jump into the comments on Facebook, Twitch, or YouTube, and ask a question, make a comment. If there's something you want to know that I'm not getting to, put the question there, and when I see it, I'll raise it with Sam. Sam, let's get back onto some of the projects that are going on now, and I know one of the ones that you have talked about a bit and drew my attention to was the carbon. Is it carbon isotopes in the plants?
You got it.
Yeah.
That's
so
it.
Now I'm hoping that I've got the right picture. Is that what they're doing here?
They're actually doing soil surveys in this picture, but I can talk about this one if you'd like.
Well, let's come back to that. Let's talk about the carbon isotopes in plants. What I'm wanting to know is what's the collection method? How do you then identify the isotopes? How are they significant? And then of course that leads into what data is shared, like in what form is it shared, and then why is it important? So there's that
was about 6 different questions.
Yeah, but they're all linked. I think one leads to the next, which leads to the next. I think.
Sure. So, maybe I can start just by explaining what a heavy carbon isotope actually is. I'll start with that.
Let's start there.
Because it's a lot. It's a lot. Although it sounds like a really fancy science word, but it's really not that complicated, I promise. So most of you probably remember being in chemistry class, and up on the wall you've got your big periodic table with all the elements on it. And in nature, in the universe, everything's made up of atoms of these different elements. And all elements have a mass. They have a weight. And the idea is all the carbon atoms in the universe, for example, should have the exact same weight. But sometimes, very, very rarely, like less than 1% of the time, we have these funny carbon atoms that are actually quite heavy. They weigh a lot more than all the other carbon in the universe. And that's what we call an isotope, when we have this funny atom that weighs a different amount than it normally would compared to all of its carbon brothers and sisters. It has a completely different mass. So that's what heavy carbon is. And why it's significant when it comes to plants is different types of plants have very different amounts of this heavy carbon stored inside of them. So some plants we call light because they just have the normal carbon in them, and some plants you could call heavy because they have a lot of this really heavy carbon in them. And the plants that tend to have the most heavy carbon are some plants that are very, very common in Australia, plants that have adapted to live in really hot climates like what we have here. tropic, desert climates, particularly the grasses and sedges that have adapted to live in these hot climates, they have a lot of this heavy carbon, whereas plants that I have here in Adelaide, the grass that grows here in Adelaide, which is in the southern part of the country and is much cooler, they don't have nearly as much of this heavy carbon.
So what can it tell us?
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, before you get there, how do you tell which plant,
how much carbon it has?
Has it? Yeah. What's the method? What is it extracted? Is it by some sort of mass spectrometry or?
You nailed it.
Right. So
what we do is we go out into the woods or into the field, and this is actually part of TERN's work. They've gone out and they've surveyed. I can't even count how many plants we've surveyed now. I know we've got over 100,000 soil and plant samples in storage that is available for analysis that we've collected over a decade or so. So we've got a lot of plant samples. And what you do is you take a really small part of that plant, like a little bit of its leaf, and you pulverize it. You grind it down to a really fine powder. And then we use the machine you just mentioned, a mass spectrometer, which essentially incinerates that powder really quickly and turns it into a gas. And then it runs through, for lack of a better word, a series of tubes which filters the gas. And in that gas, we can measure the tiny amounts of heavy carbon that were inside the plant.
And light is passed through the gas, isn't it? And then is that how?
I think because it's heavier during the. I'm not a technician, but during the process, because it's heavier, I think they can separate out the light from the heavy, and that's how they're able to measure it.
So why? And then the question is, why is it important? Is it beneficial for the plants? Like, why do the plants select to take up extra heavy isotopes? I'm guessing that probably the question really should be, are the heavy isotopes sort of evenly distributed across the country, or is there something that makes them more concentrated in certain areas? Like you mentioned, plants in hot climates, or for grasses in hot climates particularly. Do we know whether they're adapted to take out those heavy isotopes out of the soils more efficiently than grasses in a cooler climate, or are there just more of these heavy isotopes in those latitudes than or in those particular environments, or is it about soil type?
It's a really good question, actually. So whether you have a heavy carbon isotope or a light carbon isotope, they function the same. So there's really no advantage for plants to have more of one or the other. It's just sort of a process of chemistry that they wind up accumulating more. And the reason for this is because plants that live in hot climates, I'll back up. We all know about photosynthesis. Plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, sunlight, and water, and they make food for themselves. But what most people might not know is that plants that live in really hot climates have a completely different way of photosynthesizing than plants that live in cool climates. And simply by virtue of this different type of photosynthesis, they sort of accidentally wind up accumulating a lot more heavy carbon. They don't mean to do it. It's just a byproduct of the fact that they photosynthesize in a completely different way. And they get all of that carbon from the atmosphere. So heavy carbon and light carbon is evenly distributed in the atmosphere. There's no difference between northern or southern Australia, for example, and how much heavy carbon there is in the air. So that it's just by virtue of the fact that they bring in energy differently. They photosynthesize differently, and they just happen to accumulate more.
Well, there you go. So you saw the assumption that I made about how plants were taking the isotopes in. I just assumed that they were bringing them in through the root root from maybe dissolved in water or extracted through the in as part of their nutrient uptake, but no, it's actually part of the gaseous exchange as part of the cycle of photosynthesis and respiration that plants and transpiration that they that's really the right term, isn't it? Transpiration.
Yes.
I'm thinking going back to endotherms rather than plants.
You're using a lot of big words I never use when I'm describing it. I just say how the plants breathe. I just always try to use as few syllables as possible.
Well, I had to pull myself. Well, look, golden rule for my show, anyone who listens regularly, why use 10 syllables when you can use 50? That's my trademark. But as a horticulturist, I mean, it was just taking me back. I don't think I've ever discussed this with anyone since I did plant science, right? It just doesn't come up. Everyone goes photosynthesis and we all know what we're talking about. But I use the term for human energy production, which is respiration, that we do when we're getting rid of the waste gases. But for plants, it's transpiration. But I don't think I've actually said that since 1985, mate. 1995 probably. So yeah, there'll be people in the comments going, "You're really a dickhead. You don't know what you're talking about, mate."
I'm sure they'll say that about me too. Don't worry.
Well, but sad day for you. It's true.
There's always comments. Yeah. That's what I've learned about all my time in science communication. There's always comments, and sometimes it's best just not to read them.
I just have a giggle. If someone thinks they're going to hurt my feelings by telling me I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm talking about, well, welcome to life. So I don't know what I'm talking about. That's why I have experts like you on, Sam. Simple rule of the game. Now, okay, what does that knowledge about the heavy isotopes that are retained within plants through the gaseous exchange, what does it tell us? What makes it important to know?
Well, the reason it's really useful, especially when you're studying something like bird migration, for example, is if an animal, including humans, by the way, eat a plant with a lot of heavy carbon, we absorb that into our bodies. It becomes a part of our chemistry. It becomes a part of our blood and our bones. And for birds, it would be a part of their feathers. And it can actually stay inside the body for quite a while, several months, in fact, depending on the part of the body we're talking about. And what's really cool is if you measure the heavy carbon in someone's body and measure the heavy carbon in the food they eat, it should be a match. You should actually get roughly an exact match, which means I could measure the heavy carbon in somebody's blood, and it could help tell me about the types of food they eat because it should match the amount of heavy carbon in the vegetables they've been eating, for example. And the reason that's quite useful for birds is if you can imagine a bird that lives in the northern part of the country, Northern Territory, say, and it's eating some seeds up there that have a lot of heavy carbon, it's going to store that in its body. And then it'll fly south. Well, in the south, we don't have a lot of heavy carbon. So if we catch that bird, take a little blood sample, if we know how much heavy carbon is in the plants all around the country, we can work out the location of that match. So we can match the heavy carbon in the bird to the heavy carbon in the plants and figure out where it came from. We can figure out where it migrated from.
Yeah. Does the reverse apply? Like, so birds going at like it is every locality that you've sampled for heavy carbons, are they is every location got its own sort of signature? So or is it really regional, or is it,
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the map that we created, we worked out where lots of different types of plants were across the country. And we measured how much heavy carbon is in all of those different plants. And then we could make a map of the whole country that basically predicted if you're in any particular location, what's probably going to be the average amount of heavy carbon in those plants. But you're absolutely right. Some areas have really similar or identical amounts of heavy carbon. For example, forests tend to not have a lot of heavy carbon. Trees tend to not have very much at all. So they would be very similar. So you're right. When you only have one measure, the heavy carbon, you can really only pinpoint a general region. But what we're trying to do now is create more maps with other types of elements. So carbon is not the only one where you can have this heavy this heavy version. Nitrogen, we have heavy nitrogen and normal nitrogen or light nitrogen. Oxygen and hydrogen have heavy versions. So we're trying to make more maps where we measure all these different things in the plants so we can layer them, and this will allow us to be even more precise than we can be right now.
Because the heavy carbon that you've been sampling for is actually in the atmosphere, there's one way of thinking would be, wouldn't that be universal, sort of everywhere? But does that does the concentration in the air, in the gas, that all the plants and us all take in, is that dependent on weather patterns, or like why is Northern Australia heavier in concentration? Is there a hypothesis for that?
Well, again, it's because of photosynthesis. So the plants that live in Northern Australia have adapted to hot climates, and their method of photosynthesis is really, really different. So the amount in the air should be the same.
So it is universally distributed, roughly. It's just the plants that are causing it to be present within their tissues, the way they. Okay, so I hadn't picked up on that exactly. So there we go.
But you actually raise a really interesting point, because while we do consider the amount of carbon, heavy carbon in the atmosphere universal, it has changed over time. So burning of fossil fuels has actually changed the amount of heavy carbon that is in the atmosphere, which is interesting. So we've had to account for that. So things like that can change over time. But all over the world at any one time, we basically assume that it's the same amount of heavy carbon no matter where you are in the atmosphere.
Okay, let's move off that project as part of your team's monitoring. You mentioned soil sampling. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is probably quite literally the heaviest thing we have to do in our job, because we are literally collecting soils from all over the country and then making it available to scientists for their analysis. So at all of the survey sites we visit, as we mentioned, there's over 800 of them now, we dig, there's no glamorous way to say this, we dig a giant pit. It's about 1 meter deep. Which you're seeing one of our, well, actually, this is Ben Sparrow. He's the lead of our program based out of Adelaide. And he is demonstrating to everybody exactly how we do this. So what he does is you dig a 1 meter pit, and at every 10 centimeter interval, we collect 500 grams of soil, and we ship all of that soil back to our storage facilities based at the University of Adelaide, where it gets stored in climate-controlled conditions. And then we can make that soil available to anybody who wants it for various research projects. Yeah. It's hard work. It's backbreaking work.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get the soil and landscape grid up, but it's not cooperating with me. So, how many sites have you been, or has the team been sampling for the soil grid? I can't make the page open to what I want it to, so we'll go without the visual. Is that over most of the sort of 800 sites that are represented on the map, or do you start with a particular region? Like how are these sites selected, and then how do you get out to them? It's quite it's manual labour, so I'm
Yes.
imagining it's a lot slower than collecting the data than the methods where you can, for instance, doing bioacoustics.
It's a long, tough day for the person or people, usually just one or two people who are in charge of digging that pit and collecting all that soils. It is a tough day, and it is a really tough job for sure. So basically, we select our sampling sites for plants and soils simultaneously. So we choose our sites primarily based on making sure that we're covering all the different climates and all the different habitat types. And then that's where we collect the soils from. So that making sure that usually just because we're going to different climates, we're going to different habitats, we're going to be surveying lots of different types of soils and profiles. So, and you don't really quite know what you're going to get till you start digging, right? So that's how that process of site selection works. In terms of the Soil and Landscape Grid of Australia, which I think is what you were referring to there,
Yeah, yeah.
our samples do get scanned and measured for the different types of data that they provide. So, for example, measuring the texture of soils, measuring how much carbon and nitrogen is in the soil, that sort of thing that they provide information on. All of that we contribute to their efforts to make those predictions of how much is in the soil, what the soil is made up of. So we do make all of that, because we all work together, so we make all of that available to them.
There we are. It's come up now. So all the different soil types, and then yeah, really really detailed. Even on the first level of complexity. So all the concentrations in the whole Earth. Then we've got the organic carbon, clay, silt, sand, calcium carbonate or calcium chloride, available water, nitrogen, phosphorus, effective carbon exchange capacity. Really, really interesting stuff for all the soil
Yes.
scientists out there, and for anyone interested in plant health. And I'm guessing this will be really interesting and necessary information for anyone involved in agronomy. And as we move with climate change and needing to change the kind of food crops that we're growing in certain areas, and to make sure that we are utilising water far more efficiently than we have been, like to get the same food value out of a cubic metre of water now, or a megalitre of water. That's all really, it's going to be super important in the next sort of 30, 50 years, I think. So do you
And that's a
feel...
big part of our mission too, to contribute not only to the pure research, environmental research that's happening at, say, universities, but we also want to make sure we're collecting information that industry can use to make good economic and environmental decisions. So that's always something we think about too. We're not just thinking about what types of data might, a pure scientist in their laboratory need. We're also thinking about, what does industry need? What does government need?
Yeah, and society as a whole. That just led me to think, sometimes I talk to people, Sam, quite often, where we're talking about projects where, the researchers and the practical workers on the ground are busting a gut year after year after year after year. But every time there's a survey done, the numbers are going in the wrong direction. Right. And then every time we look at vegetation cover over a 10-year period, we're losing vegetation cover. We're losing habitat. So the whole, eco grief kind of mindset can set in. But I'm guessing you're in the fortunate position where you can see the positive aspect of all of the work that you're doing, that it's necessary information for people to make the decisions like we were just talking about. So I'm guessing you're not feeling eco grief every day after work.
Not every day. Certainly, I think I'm like anyone else, particularly people who work in the industry, who work in science, environmental science. You definitely feel that. It's definitely hard sometimes. But I think there's a lot in Australia to be positive about. I think in the last year or so, there's been a big change in our culture. I think people are really starting to think a lot more about the environment. They're certainly starting to feel the impacts of what the future has in store for us with bushfires and floods. And I think that's brought people to recognizing this isn't a future problem, this is a now problem. And we need to be dedicating a lot more of our time and energy towards that. It's nice to see that net zero goals are being taken far more seriously now. I think that's a lot to be positive about as well. And like you say, we wouldn't go out and collect all this data if we didn't think people could use it to make good decisions. And that's really why we're doing it, because sometimes, the trends don't always go in the direction you want, but the point is to make people aware of what's happening so that we can identify what the problems are and work to change them.
I might note for people who are unfamiliar with TERN until now that there's a bushfire study section in as part of TERN. So
yes, indeed, yeah.
So it's amazing how much things have changed. Where when I was doing horticulture and horticulture became part of the School of Forestry and merged in with agriculture. I mean, the nearly all of the discussion was about economic impacts, and conservation was always on the fringe, but now it's dead set in the centre of just about everything that bodies like TERN are doing, and most of the faculties at uni in the in the environmental sciences, ecology space. So that's a good way that we've moved. Sam, what are some of the other significant projects that are going on now with TERN?
Well, one of the big things we're doing right now is we're really starting to make use of drones. So we're bringing a lot of new technology into what TERN does. So you mentioned very briefly LiDAR earlier. So we've been using drones at a lot of our monitoring sites. Last couple of years, we've been sort of testing the technology, tweaking it, making sure we get it right. And what we do is we go out and we run our drones across these field sites, and we can create really accurate three-dimensional models of those sites, far more detailed than what we've been able to do in the past. And the cool thing about that is, rather than just knowing what species are there and how many might be there, we can calculate something called biomass. So we can actually get a physical sense of literally, like physically, how much tree is there, basically, is a way of thinking about it. And we've never been able to do that in the past. And that means that someone, a scientist somewhere else in the world perhaps, who would never be able to visit this site, who would never be able to go out into the bush and see this place, can see it exactly for what it is. And I think that's a pretty cool thing that we've been working on lately.
Yeah. For people who don't know what LiDAR is, if you've ever watched one of those Great Pyramids kind of documentaries or any of those Time Team kind of shows, they often use LiDAR to scan and map chambers within within the pyramids or whatever, and they use ground penetrating radar is different, but the principles are sort of the same. That you are you're able to see something without your eyes being able to recognise it in the same way that light and electrical representations of light. I think that's broadly right.
That's it. I'm not an expert in LiDAR either, but that's generally what it is.
Yeah, I mean, we can't see it, but the machines can, and then we've worked out how to represent what the machines can read and present it visually in a way that it makes sense to us. I think that's it. But you can
use it to estimate the height of things too. So we can get really accurate estimates of how tall all of the trees are relative to one another. It's pretty amazing.
That's right, and it's a lot easier than trigonometry.
Yes,
for most of it. So, I'm always interested in the soundscapes aspect of what's going on. So, bioacoustics. What can you tell us about the scale of the monitoring that's happening with TERN? Like, is it really localized, or is the idea that it's going to spread out across all of the sampling sites as well?
So of the 900, 800 or so sites that we have a dozen sites that are, well, we used to call them super sites because that's exactly what we think they are, but they are set up to do a lot of the more detailed monitoring that you're talking about, including bioacoustics. So those would be the places that we do a lot of the bioacoustics work. It's also where we do the camera trapping. So when we try to see what animals might also be in the area. And these sites, there's only a dozen of them, but we've placed them in really distinct parts of the country in completely different environments from one another. So although you might say, oh, there's only 12, these 12 sites are really comparable to, or they're really distinct from one another. So we can compare what's happening in all different parts of the country.
So they become like your baseline sites, and then for if those super sites are extended to become one day 100, that they're the sites that you can compare for a baseline in 2020, for instance.
I can't imagine we'd ever have 100. These super sites are pretty intense. Amongst some of the things that we have there, we actually have these things called flux towers, which are these really tall towers that reach above the canopy. And they measure, for example, how much water and carbon is being exchanged between the plants and the atmosphere every 10 seconds. And they do this 24/7, 365 days a year. So it's a pretty big operation, these super sites. Don't imagine we're going to have any more. But they are really good because they do set a baseline for those regional areas that we've put them in for comparisons. And because we've been collecting data there for so long, years and years now, you can look to the past and see how things have changed and make broader predictions about the future.
So let's tie down. How long have those super sites been going? Like, are they all of a comparable age, or are some much newer than others?
I think it's a bit variable. I don't know the age of all of the different sites, so I wouldn't want to hazard a guess because I think I'd probably get it wrong. But certainly, several of them at the very least have been operating for quite a few years.
Great. I think I saw one of those highlighted on one of the David Attenborough, one of his plant specials, I think, where they were up right at the top of the canopy and measuring the gaseous exchange. So obviously it wasn't in Australia. I think it was in one of the cloud forests, I think in equatorial Central America, I think, from memory. But
it's the exact same idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's important that this kind of work is happening around the world so that changes can be noticed, and then what's causing the changes, or whether they're significant in what they may lead to. It's important that the monitoring is holistic, and that's what really excited me about the scale of TERN. And look, I've got to plead ignorance. I'd seen so much of the comms on Twitter and whatnot about TERN, but I'm interested in all this stuff. But I'm guessing that I'm like most people too, that I bookmark it, I save it, and then I don't have time to go back and read it in details. So I'm lucky that I get to I get to ask anything I want today.
Exactly.
Yeah. Look, I know that you're probably not going to say that TERN has any project that's more important than any other, because they're all important. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allocated the resources to do them. But have you got a personal favourite that you are tracking closely?
I'm really biased because TERN is divided. We all work together. We're one cohesive unit, but just internally to keep things straight for people. We do work in little hubs and groups, and I'm biased to the hub that I work in, of course. I'm always going to be a bit biased, and I think I'm constantly blown away by, in particular, the field teams that go out and work and collect and do all the surveys where they go out to these really remote places. People may not realize they're away from home probably 2 weeks out of every 4, and they're camping in really rugged places a lot of the time, really bad cell phone reception, I can tell you that. So they often don't get much chance to talk with their families and friends. It's a really tough job. It's a really, really tough job. So I don't know if I'm tracking it. I have such admiration, and I think they've got one of the toughest jobs at TERN. I think is that field team that goes out, because they sacrifice a lot of time, a lot of energy. They come back with a lot of bumps and bruises sometimes from working out there, and the whole country benefits from the work that they do. And they're really unsung heroes. You know, they don't get their names on fancy research publications. They don't get the glory, but if they weren't doing what they're doing, none of it would be possible.
Well, I always like to recognise I call them the practical conservationists, the people who, as you say, they're not the authors of the papers or the co-authors of the papers, but they're the people washing up the equipment, packing up the tent,
They're also
preparing a
brilliant
site.
scientists, because they go out to
Absolutely.
new parts of the world, and it's their job to identify all these different subspecies of plants and work out, is this eucalyptus species, or is it a hybrid eucalyptus that no one's seen before? Like, they're figuring all of that out on the spot. And I am good at a few things, but I was never a good taxonomist. It was never something I was particularly talented in. So they're not just hard workers. They're really talented scientists too.
I really hope that over time I get to speak to more of the team TERN team. How do you refer to yourselves? Are you team TERN team?
We're just TERN. We're just TERN. I think that's how yeah.
I'm intrigued by so many of these projects. So, and a lot of them
are hard to talk about them all, isn't it? I think we collect over 100 different types of data, so we would need a really long show to go through them all.
Well, look, breaking news. For the rest, coming in October, Gardens for Habitat becomes a side project of the bird emergency, and we're going to do far more planty stuff and habitat stuff. So I think there's going to be an opportunity to delve a bit more into the soil science and the heavy carbon stuff and some of the water stuff, I think, Sam. So if you'd like to join me again and geek out even more on that stuff, that would be really great. But I'd like to keep sort of in touch and keep an eye on what's happening. So I'll try and be tapped in far more to TERN and see if someone can help me understand what data might be interesting for me to present in with the YouTube and the podcast for people who are interested. So I'll be leaning on you a little bit more for some guidance in that, Sam.
Absolutely.
Sam, I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of what your sort of maybe 5 or 10 year plan is for your your career, sort of apart from TERN. Like, have you got any desire to go back to be a field researcher and do some postdoc in any particular? Like, do you want to find something out about thresher sharks, or do you want to get back in under the sea, talking to some crustaceans or some mollusks?
Do you know, I think it's kind of funny when you look at the weird, twisty, turny career I've had, because I could tell you I have a plan, but my career changed like 10 plans ago. So, when I started my PhD, I was definitely going to be a professor of shark research, and that's clearly not what happened. So, this sounds really odd. I have a general idea of what I want to be doing, but I have stopped trying to make really rigorous plans about the direction of my career because my career doesn't seem to want to play ball, and I just seem to be jumping into all of these crazy opportunities that look nothing like the thing that I did before. That seems to be my strategy, is just constantly finding something new to do. So I guess maybe that's the plan. Just constantly be finding something new to challenge myself with seems to be my mode of operation.
Sam, the point of this next question is for people who are not working in science, and particularly in government-funded science and grant-dependent science. So, preface why it's quite a personal kind of question, but how difficult is it to plan? And I asked the question in a particular way, what's your 10-year plan? How hard is it for someone working in conservation, ecology, life sciences that is generally dependent on short-term or medium-term grants to actually plan for a long commitment like a 40-year mortgage?
Yeah, look, I won't lie to you. It's hard. I won't sugarcoat that. And this is global. This is not just Australia, but I'll use Australian examples. Right now, young researchers, so people who've graduated with their PhD, basically post 5 years their PhD, they apply for a limited number of government grants. And one of those grants, which is available from the Australian Research Council, they've got about a 10 to 15% chance of getting one of those grants that would fund their salary and research costs.
Funny enough, you mentioned that. Because of COVID, we had to put this off, but we were going to be talking this morning at 9:00 about the latest round of Australian Research Council grants, where 1 out of 500 went to an environmental/conservation project.
Yes.
And that, if you're listening and watching, is why I've been running that little pin tweet semi-survey on my Twitter about what people thought were their top 10 funding priorities for government. Because the fact that only 1 in 500 basically went to the environment is the biggest load of bullshit I've ever seen. It just goes to show that even though we're talking about a crisis and an impending, biodiversity extinction crisis, and perhaps a complete rejig of the way we live in an urban society and the way we produce food, that just it's not even on the radar for, and no one else is funding the work, are they, Sam? It's all coming from the government.
Well, there are charitable organizations and some industry bodies that do fund environmental
But where do the charitable organizations get their money from?
Yes, that's true. They get money from people. I think it's important.
And where does Minderoo and all those places get their money from? They get them from tax breaks and whatnot. So it all comes from the government in the end. And it's not...
I was going to say, with the recent ARC results, I do want to say that I think it's really hard to... because every field is so different. Every project is so different. And when you're applying for those grants, I doubt that there's a bad idea in the whole lot, regardless of the
I'm
discipline.
not saying that. I'm not saying that at all, Sam. No.
Really, the issue is we just need to see more funding for early career researchers, regardless of their discipline, across the board. Because then we would see more funds going to topics like the environment and conservation. We would see more of that, and that's really, I think, the heart of the issue. And hopefully, that's something that will change going forward.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's part of the role I have to play here is, to be an advocate and be grumpy. But I reckon there was more than one that went to some kind of medical research. That I'm not saying it's bad, but sometimes the quality, people's quality of life in it's really hard to say any of this without sounding like a complete asshole. But you know, if we can't work out a way to make sure we've got enough water and have enough food, it doesn't really matter if we're making incremental or marginal change in some other fields of life at the moment. That's the point I'm making, which means I was staggered by the way the grants went. It's not a. I mean, obviously, we're still not at the top of mind. So yeah, and I know you can't say too much about it, Sam, but you know
Oh well, I think one of the tricky things too with especially with these types of grants is there's a great deal of curiosity-driven pure research. And one of the funny things about that type of research is you never quite know all of the impacts that work is going to have. So I never liked, yeah, exactly. I always liked the story of how discovering penicillin was a mistake. It was an accidental discovery, right? So I think it's important that we give our scientists a lot of room to study what they're passionate about and what makes them feel creative. I really do think that the issue just comes down to, there's not enough money going in general, and that would solve a big part of this problem.
That's exactly the point, Sam, and that's where all of these things get set up so that it's a competition between 500 worthy projects, but nobody's asked for the 18 billion in JobSeeker back. You're right. That's my sort of problem, in that there should be plenty of money for everyone to find out the answers and to actually make some changes, but no, that's why I mean we're not front of mind. I don't like the way that we set everything up that, I fell into it, because there is only a pool of so much money for 500 grants. I don't like the outcome, but there shouldn't be such a minimal pool. Someone doing a PhD shouldn't be trying to live off 90 grand over 3 years. That's just ridiculous, if that's the way I see it, that we shouldn't be making people. I think someone working in conservation and solving the problems for our food and water security and making sure that we don't lose the koalas should be being paid more than a brickie labourer. That's the point I'm making.
That's probably a better question for a politician, not an ecologist.
No. I'm not asking you a question. I'm making a judgment and value-based call of mine. Let's be clear about that. But the issue isn't that we don't have enough money within the society. It's where we're choosing to put it. That's the point I'm making. So there we go. On that heavy note, Sam, tell us what you're most excited to be working on in TERN over, let's say, the next 12 months. What's coming up that you are excited to get your teeth into?
Oh gosh, yeah. So I actually just came back from maternity leave not too long ago. So I'm just in general really excited to be back at work at all, let alone working on different specific projects. It's just nice to be back in an office. That's been pretty thrilling for me the last couple months. But we're going to be building on, well, I'm going to be building with my colleagues on the isotope work that we've done in previous years. And the hope is that that's going to make things more precise, more powerful for people, for example, who want to study migration of different animals, and really just, giving them more ways to be more precise and more accurate in the work that they do.
That particular project, Sam, the heavy isotopes, is that an open-ended program, or does it have a distinct end date?
Well, TERN projects, we have timelines for all of the things that we want to deliver. Yep. Some of our projects are ongoing. So, for example, I mentioned the flux towers. That doesn't have an end date. We're constantly collecting those data. The projects that I do, though, we're creating specific products that once they're built, they're done. and then you have to move on to the
Move
next
on
one.
to the next
So
one.
exactly. So my hope is that within a year, the next few maps will be done.
Okay, so how, on a rough proportion basis, how far through that project is the team?
Well, I just restarted it because I just came back from paternity leave. So
Oh,
I would say
so you are the
yeah.
team when it comes to synthesizing the information and presenting it.
Well, as far as these isotopes projects are concerned, I wouldn't say I am the team. What I would say is I am leading the team on those couple projects. A lot of people are helping me with it, that's for sure. And because I was away, nothing happened for a little while. So now that I'm back, we're going to kickstart it.
So, but look, I've got to approach it like a sports commentator, Sam. Are you halfway through? Are you at the halfway?
No.
Half
I
time?
would say we're at this. We're very close to the starting line on some of these, but I suspect it'll go at a decent clip. So I'm hoping that by the end of not within a year or maybe a bit more, we'll have some new products to share with people.
Okay, and by product, does that mean a map or
new data maps that people can access?
Yeah. Are there other visualization tools that you're using apart from what, like I brought up on the screen before, that we would recognize as a map? Are there other kinds of visualization tools, or are there audio resources? What other kind of things, products is TERN delivering?
I would say most of our data gets delivered in the form of maps and spreadsheets. Those would be our two big ones. Those would be the two most common ones. But certainly, if you can ask, some of the data files are so large that it's really hard for us to make them available for people to just download. So sometimes you do have to make requests, but of course we'll always provide them. You just have to let us know what you want. So some of those things would probably be the things like the sounds, the bioacoustics that you were talking about. Those files are really large, and you might be wanting a particular place in a particular time segment, so you'd have to get in touch with us. We also do quite a bit of citizen science as well, which is neat. So we have a couple of different apps that people can use and collect data with us, which is fun.
Funnily enough, you mentioned that. I knew we'd get to there. Now, when we do, we'll do a different show about citizen science if somebody from TERN wants to join in.
It's a big topic.
Yeah, well,
I can think of a few people.
I'm actually doing a citizen science show on Monday where we're talking about a bunch of current projects that are out there and are available. But I want to highlight one that the episode for this just dropped today on the bird emergency. So this is Rob Ashworth's red rump parrot citizen science project. So we've got to put some bird stuff into the bird emergency. So you can go to thebirdemergency.com/redrumpuary or thebirdemergency.com/redrumps, and you can either listen to the show and read a little bit and see the visuals that accompany that show, or with the Red Rumps link, you can sign up directly to be part of Rob's citizen science monitoring of the nesting hollows of the red rump parrot. So thanks for giving me that nice in. I didn't have to stick it in there. Didn't have to stick it in there as an ad. And look, while I'm there, while we're doing ads, coming up, there's a show for this amazing book for people living in the suburbs and the towns of Australia, A Guide to the Creatures in Your Neighbourhood. Because we like people noticing what's out there. So that's from the Urban Field Naturalist Project. Look out for it in your bookshops. My review of it will be coming out shortly, but it's out there, and I can recommend that you go and get it if you're interested in the fungi, the insects, the birds, the flowers, the trees, the bats, the snails of your local area. that you can then notice and get involved in a citizen science project, or just use eBird or iNaturalist. Or what portals can people do citizen science with at the moment with TERN?
Yeah, so the big one that it seems to be quite popular with people is called Wild Orchid Watch, and it's an app you can download on your phone. And if you're going on a nature hike, you're out there and you see a wild orchid, we would love if you could snap a photo of that and tell us where you are, because we are working on creating a database that can tell scientists where all the different orchid species are in Australia, and they can use that to work towards different conservation goals, because some of these species are incredibly rare. And so it can be really hard to locate them if you're just one scientist or one lab, one survey team trying to get it all done. So having citizen science help us with this kind of work is really, really valuable.
That sounds like a perfect project to follow up for Gardeners for Habitat, doesn't it? Hey?
It does.
All right, well, Sam, thanks for joining me. I think I've ear-bashed you enough for that. It's been great of you to join the Bird Emergency. I love these bird-adjacent shows, so sorry if you're just hardcore bird and you don't like all this, but we can't do one without the other. That's why it's important. We need to know all this stuff to make good decisions over there to affect something over here. So, yeah, great. Sam, enjoy the rest of... Well, enjoy being back at work, but also...
Yes.
Enjoy being a mum.
Oh, it's been quite the adventure.
Oh, it's so good to meet you. I hope we can do this again. Thanks for watching, those of you who were with us for the duration. No questions or comments, Sam. So you know what that leads me to think? I must have done an okay job today, because no one was feeding me questions.
We just explained everything so well. That's why.
Well, I hope people now have a bit of an understanding about TERN and how it's so important. Gee, we didn't even talk about all the partner organisations, but I'll put all of that on the website, and more information with Sam and all the links I can think of. And I'm sure after having our discussion, Sam will probably send me some more things that she'd like me to include, so people can easily find them. Yeah, been fantastic. Thanks, Facebook. Thanks, YouTube. And thank you, Twitch, for being with us. You can find any of those links too. If you're listening later and you want to be involved when we go live, thebirdemergency.com/live. Everything goes out on that page. But if you want to go on your native platform, thebirdemergency.com/ either Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. Really quite easy. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Sam Monroe, ecologist. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd. This has been the Bird Emergency. See you next time. Oh, if you like YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel. I need some numbers to get access to a new feature. Thank you. Bye, everyone.